Good morning. We gather in this circle to continue exploring the theme Sidetracks from the Spirit, and today we explore the theme of suffering. We come into this circle welcome just as we are. Welcome to be just where we're at. Grateful or grumpy. Happy or not so much. Peaceful or anxious. Angry or accepting. And all the shades in between. We come in the freedom of this land and this place where without fear we're free to be, we're free to gather, we're free to assemble, we're free to question, we're free to express our thoughts and ideas, we're free to be ourselves. And we come here in deep gratitude for the long witness of this land on which we gather. We come mindful of the history, the spirituality, the culture of the Cree peoples who've made their home on this land for generations and generations. And we honor the heritage of the Métis people of this land, and we gather with respect for our responsibilities under Treaty 6 and our responsibilities to be a good neighbor. So we cast this circle, inviting each other to find peace and joy in this time together. And we sing our way into this circle. Words that invite us to center and focus in this time we share. We respond to each other. Some of us are drawn here by our quest. We come in our search of hope and meaning. Some of us are here in the midst of our grief. In search of strength and comfort. Some of us are seeking wisdom. Among us are those who have come to search, and those who have come to grieve, and those who have come to deepen their vision. Together we journey into the mystery of all that is sacred. Light is one of the most universal symbols for that great mystery in which we live. And sometimes light brings us warmth and clarity. Sometimes it brings into focus things we'd rather not see. Sometimes the brightness of light hurts our eyes. And we gather this day in the midst of all that is illuminated for us, both the joy and the pain of living. And we come seeking the warmth of love, the strength of hope, that we might live in the light of this new day with joy and with gratitude. And together we bring our prayer, offering these words to strengthen our intentions to live more nearly as we pray. Into this time, we take our place to listen underneath, within and beyond our world of words. We gather seeking comfort in the midst of our losses, to share what we have found to be true, to shoulder our burdens together, to find wisdom for the path before us, to pursue justice where hope seems lost, to find peace where we're anxious. We pray as those seeking to find wisdom for our living. May it be so.
Our first reading is from the wisdom tradition of ancient Israel. The book of Job begins with a folk tale, moves into many chapters of poetry, and ends with a brief narrative. This reading is from the first chapter, part of the folktale section. One day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job's house and said, "The oxen are plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them when the Sabines attacked them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another came and said, "Fire fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And yet while he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another one came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking in their eldest brother's house when a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell down upon these young people, and they are all dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job rose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground in reverence. This is an ancient folk tale that has been passed down to us in the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Scriptures.
You're really all very awake. And you figured out what to do. I don't know about for you, but those opening words from the book of Job sound to me a lot like the lyrics of a country and western song. You know the kind of ballad I mean. You lose your job, you lose your security to bad investment, your wife leaves you for your best friend, and then the dog runs away from home. And like Job, our ancient folk hero, there have been those times in our lives where everything that can go wrong does, right? And if we didn't have bad luck, we wouldn't have any. And it doesn't rain. It pours. But in the world of the ancient folk tale, Job corners the market on a bad day. The Sabaeans steal his oxen and donkeys, kidnap their keepers, except for one, who returns to tell Job the tragic tale. And then a fireball falls from the sky and fries all the sheep, and a single shepherd survives the blaze and recounts it in horrifying detail to Job. And then the Chaldeans come for the camels, and they kill their keepers, except for the one who gets away. And then in the fourth verse of the ballad, a freak desert storm collapses the house where Job's eldest son and all of his siblings have gathered for a party, and none of the young people escape except for the one who comes to tell Job this horrific tale. And there we have it. A guy who, at the end of the day, has lost everything except his health and his marriage, and if you keep reading in the next chapter, you'll discover that that reprieve, too, was very short-lived. But this once beyond all time tale leaves us with a community of survivors. Job and 4 trauma victims who each carry the story of the respective tragedies. But after the very first scene in this story, those 4 trauma victims fall off the page completely, and we never hear from them ever again. The story replaces them with 4 friends who come to comfort Job. 4 friends who bring their conventional wisdom, their pat answers, those who come with no listening skills, and their unquestioned theological convictions, and they provide a form of comfort that's somewhere between torment and torture. They're self-appointed investigators. Mostly they just want to help Job find a cause for these calamities. They need to know the reason why all this has happened. They need to know what Job did to bring all this on himself. Because if Job isn't to blame, then who is? In the ancient world of their theological understanding, there is only one other culprit that's possible. If Job isn't to blame, how do they explain these actions of their all-powerful, all-knowing God? Because in their worldview, everything that happens is attributable to their God. Their God rewards their goodness with blessings and punishes their wrongs with one of the three terrible Ds, either disease or disaster or death. We know how life can change on a dime. We know how a day can change everything. We know how a split second can make all the difference. We know the impermanence and the unpredictability of life. And we also know the sheer wonder that we're here at all. That a great flaring forth came to form this molten planet. That in the fullness of time, a crust formed, and we are perched like a speck and held to this crust by the wonder of gravity. We turn on the news, we pick up the newspaper, we call a friend, we listen to our own life, and we know that Job's story is a fiction whose truth is lived out every day. That it's a once upon a time story that never happened and is always happening. That tragedy and loss are part of life. They're not exceptions to life. They are part of the whole, part of life. And sometimes we can act to prevent tragedy, and sometimes by our wisdom and our skill and our good fortune, we can postpone loss. But whenever it comes and however it comes, death will always be with us. And if we've had the good fortune to be born, we'll also have the good fortune to die. Sometimes sooner, sometimes later. But I've often wondered how this story might have gone if it had become the story of how this community of survivors went on. If the 4 survivors in the story hadn't been sidelined and preempted by the 4 who weren't at all in touch with their humanity or their mortality, how might Job's journey with tragedy and loss have been different? Instead of a community of friends trying to name and blame, maybe a community of survivors might have created the kind of care and comfort and compassion that could have helped one another lay down the path before them. And instead of abdicating or attributing everything to the tribal god of earth and sky, could they have found and built meaning and shelter for each other? Could that community of survivors have found their way into a spirituality that celebrates mystery, reverences life, honors death, embraces hope and meaning amid the uncertainty of life? Maybe if the survivors had stayed together, they would have come to name their experiences as acts of violence or acts of greed, or in some cases acts of hatred, and in respect of the storm, an act of nature, or acts of the nature of life itself. But none of their experience was punishment. None of their experience was the act of any god. Maybe they might have come to value their vulnerability and to heal the guilt that each of them may have felt in surviving when others they love didn't. And together they might have been able to begin the great work of birthing one another back to life, into lives that were forever altered by the loss they experienced, but nonetheless lives that could still be worth living. As a community of survivors, touched by the deepest joys and pains of living, maybe they would have traded in their notions of God as the name of some all-knowing, all-powerful super being at the helm of all that happens. And maybe they would have discovered God to be a verb rather than a noun. As they shared each other's tears and validated each other's pain and supported each other's courage and nurtured each other's hope, they might have enabled each other to weave the threads of loss into the ever-changing fabric of their lives. They might have helped each other survive their losses, deepen their pain into wisdom, and find potential to keep on living and to keep on loving. Like love, maybe the word God is best understood as a verb. As those powerful, creative, and life-giving acts, small and great, that are within our power to do. Love can't shelter one another from the storm, but surely it can provide shelter in the storm. Maybe as a community of survivors, they could have shared the experience of inexplicable loss and both the gift and the guilt of surviving as they work together to rebuild their lives on the very foundation of their losses. It's easy to be sidetracked by our suffering. It's easy to be sidetracked in our suffering by the questions that consume us. The what ifs and the why me and the what did I do to deserve this and the what could I have done differently? And the what kind of God wills this or allows this or fails to prevent this? But a community of survivors, each trying to lay down a new track none of them would ever have chosen, supporting each other in the long work of finding gift and meaning in life again. That's something different. Isn't being a spiritual community about the work of Godding? The work of loving each other back to life again when surviving is one of the hardest things to do. What does it look like to be a community embodying the gift of presence, rather than seeking the fingerprints of some kind of divine intent or a lesson to be learned, or a question that can never be answered? This is a time for us to pause and think about what it would mean for us as a spiritual community, as spiritual beings in a human experience, to be about the practice of Godding. Our tradition gives us another prayer of friends, a prayer prayed by friends in the first century, a prayer offered in the wisdom tradition of Jesus of Nazareth, a prayer given in response to the question, "Teach us to pray." Patterned after that prayer and phrased in a more contemporary language, I invite us to offer this prayer with one another. We embrace the sacredness of life with awe and reverence, and we commit ourselves to work for a more fair and just world. We seek to live with deep intention that all may have enough for today. May we let go of all the guilt and regret that encumbers us and embraces relationship of trust, offering and receiving forgiveness as a way to freedom. May we live examined lives, inspired to find meaning and purpose in our living, working to transform every challenge into an opportunity to grow and thrive. May it ever be so. One of the seemingly unique attributes about being human is that we invariably try to name our experiences. And one of the ways we name ourselves, when we come through a life-threatening situation or a life-altering experience, we call ourselves a survivor. In every obituary we read of those who live on beyond the time of the one who has died, being survived by his parents or her siblings or a loving spouse. Those who experience a serious or traumatic event, whether it's an accident or an intimate assault or intrusive violation, a natural disaster or a life-threatening illness, are identified as survivors. And we know how to be a son or a daughter, we know how to be a citizen, we know how to be in our employment, in the job we're in, we know how to be a taxpayer, we know how to be a spouse, we know how to be a parent, but what does it mean to be a survivor? How do we live as a survivor? I met that question again and again during our time in Rwanda. Over and over again, we would be introduced to someone, I'm sure this was your experience too, Joanne, introduced to someone who would be named to us as, this is so-and-so. They're a survivor. By which they meant someone who against all odds was not killed in 1994 when over the course of 100 days, nearly 1 million Tutsis were brutally murdered, mainly by their Hutu neighbors, sometimes by their own family members, and often by friends. While there had been numerous mass murders of Tutsis in the years that preceded 1994, during the 1994 genocide, the greatest number of mass murders took place in churches. Churches like these. Churches where these Rwandans had fled or had been lured, having every reason to expect safety, but instead often experiencing betrayal by their priests and by the neighbors with whom they had shared a pew in those churches for many years. Those who did survive live with the memory of having witnessed the torture and death of family members. Many of the women who survive live with the trauma and aftermath of having been brutally raped, having been violated again and again, birthing and raising children conceived in violence, and sometimes infected with HIV and AIDS. Some of the remaining survivors are the only members of their family. Some were children during the 1994 genocide who have grown up to be young adults without the care, the nurture, the support of any family. 22 years later, with the scars of grief and loss, so many that we met are living into what it means to survive, and what it means to survive alongside those who were responsible for their loss, unspeakable loss. In 1980, a novel by Judith Guest was turned into a screenplay that won 4 Academy Awards. Many of you will remember the movie Ordinary People. It is the story of parents and their youngest son who survived the loss of their eldest son and the older brother, Buck, who died in a boating accident. Beth, who is the mother in this family, survives by shielding herself from feeling any more pain in living. She just wants to look and feel and act like nothing ever happened, moving through life with a great numbness. She has closed herself off, just like she closed the door to her son's room, leaving everything just the way it was the day he died. And she survives by busying herself with all manner of superficiality to try to forget, to try to distract herself from the way in which her life has been shattered. She doesn't let herself even cry at her own son's funeral. She withholds affection from her surviving son, and she seemingly holds him responsible for the death of his brother. She lives to escape into small talk, into the opportunities to get away from their lives and their home and the memories that might remind her of what she has lost. The father lives into the loss of his son with a great sense of anxiety, with a huge sense of anxiety for his surviving son, Conrad. The dad's constant companions are grief and worry. And he blames himself for missing the cues that his youngest son is drowning in guilt for having survived the boating accident that claimed his brother's life. And this father lives with the trauma of having discovered his youngest son in the midst of a suicide attempt and feels responsible for Conrad's desperation. When we meet Conrad, the younger son in the film, he's trying to re-enter his life after having been unsuccessful in trying to end his life. By the time we meet him in the film, he has spent 4 months in a psychiatric hospital, and he's still haunted by the memory of the boating accident that he survived and the memories of his brother's death. He's unable to connect with friends, and he and his brother, the community that had been around them, that they had been part of together, he can no longer connect with those friends. It's just too painful. And he's isolated in his family by his mother's detachment and his father's worry and his father being torn between he and his mother. In this scene we're about to watch, Conrad has begun to find some painful insight into his experience of being a survivor. In this scene, in a panic, he has reached out to his psychiatrist for help. Like the folk tale character Job, Conrad was trying to figure out what it meant to be a survivor, how to live with his guilt of still being here when his brother was no longer here, consumed with the guilt of surviving when his promising brother hasn't. He's convinced he'd done something wrong, that somehow he was responsible. And he was consumed with the unanswerable question as to why his brother let go, why he didn't hang on. But in the world of the story, his life began to change with his insight that the only thing he did wrong was that he survived. And he began to move beyond the guilt of having survived into the gift of what it was to still be alive. It's easy to be sidetracked by the guilt of surviving. In the world of fiction, Conrad and his father each figure out a way out of the isolating guilt by breaking the silence and opening to each other's pain. Maybe that's the first step to the kind of healing Nietzsche spoke of when he said, "To live is to suffer." But to survive is to find some meaning in suffering. So many of the survivors we met in Rwanda find meaning in the midst of the demands of life, the sheer demands of survival, of feeding their families, of getting their children to school, of taking care of one another, and in the community of sharing their pain. Finding some meaning is not the same as finding answers to the how and the why. Finding meaning is acknowledging what is and finding a way forward on the road that one would never have chosen to be on. For so many survivors in Rwanda, it would be easy to be derailed by the guilt of those who were responsible for your unspeakable losses. But the long road of healing we witness involved survivors sharing their stories with each other, establishing public places of memory, establishing genocide memorials around the country in the very places where lives were so brutally ended. And being involved with each other in shaping restorative justice circles to determine how to create accountability for those unspeakable acts. There is so much pain for us to share and so much for us to learn from these brothers and sisters who are building a road for survivors to walk into the future together, finding meaning in unspeakable suffering. And to varying degrees, we're all survivors. We're a circle of survivors. We're here. Others we love are not. And we are forced to confront the serious thing that it is to be alive on this fresh morning, in this broken world. So let us take time to consider what that asks of us. There are often times in our lives where it seems like all the light has gone out, and there's no air in the room, and all that has created meaning and purpose for us has disappeared. And somewhere, from some unbidden place, a flicker of light comes, a breath of air moves through, and we are kindled again, back to life. We go to take that kind of light to a world that needs it desperately. We go with the little and the great lights that are within us. We go to share our hope, our questions, our search, together as a community who are here, who have the gift of life, and who are determined to live in the light we have for as long as we have it. And we go in grace and hope and possibility, and we go carrying light within us.